Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this ridiculously fast forward and turbulent planet. Here in the early stages of the Anthropocene and maybe the end stages of the Anthropocene at the same time. This is Andy Revkin. This is another episode of Sustain What coming to you on whatever channel you're watching on. Um, I'm really, really happy to reconnect after a number of years with Adam Frank, University of Rochester astrophysicist and wide ranging thinker and deep diver on all kinds of questions. I posted earlier just a few of his um, explorations and I mean we live at a point where basic physics, the basics of science, have started to retreat from how we make decisions. Maybe that's always been true to a certain extent, except behavioral science. But it's good to use the powers of physics and the other sciences to try to understand where we're at, where we might be going. And there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of consequence there. And we have lots to talk about, but I had to just bring up the meteor that swept over the Midwest, and we couldn't hear it here in Maine, but apparently the bang was heard quite a distance. And I know you think about a lot of things. I'm not sure if you've had time to ponder the significance of seeing something like this, but it was quite stunning for a lot of people.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. I mean, I just saw the video like everybody else. I didn't hear any, but I mean, yeah, there's stuff
There it is.
raining down from space. So there we go. Bam.
Yeah, like being in Siberia. When was that? 2013 or so.
The
The
Chebalinsk. Yeah, that one was the explosion in that case, like blew windows out. So I don't think this
right,
one reached
right.
that level of.
I love how the dogs react here. I'm not playing
Oh,
the
yeah.
sound. Just
Oh, yeah, the dogs are freaking out.
yeah. So what when you see something like this, what's the first thing you say to someone about both what it represents in a bigger way about the state of our solar system and there's been some
Uh,
progress lately on sort of asteroid deflection possibilities, but
yeah,
how does this play in
yeah.
your head?
Well, actually, wrote something on my newsletter not too long ago about like if the dinosaurs had the technology that we're just beginning to get, then they'd still be around and we wouldn't, right? Because
Right.
it was a much larger version of that took them out. And yeah, just recently there was a new paper that showed the DART mission, which happened in 2022, where we tested the idea of redirecting a asteroid that by slamming something into it that worked even better than we thought it did before. So we
Right.
can go into details on that if you want, but basically we're starting to get the technology to where if we did see something like what killed the dinosaurs heading towards us, we might be able to get out there early enough and keep it from hitting us. So this idea of planetary protection is something that sort of drives, it's one step, and there need to be a lot more to the idea of us becoming a long-term, a million-year civilization, right?
Right.
That obviously we have to get through climate change. That's another thing, but to become a long-term civilization, long-term technosphere, that's one of the steps. So it's pretty cool that mission worked. And what this sort of reminds us of is the fact that stuff is actually always raining down on the earth, right? There's
Right.
I wrote something a long time ago, and I did the calculation for how much dust from meteorites, from sand grain sized meteorites or interstellar dust particles, which are interplanetary dust particles, which are constantly wafting down. And there's, actually that stuff has been really important in the history of the Earth for the delivery of all kinds of things to the planet. So we're actually connected to the greater solar system in ways that we don't really imagine. So I think what I was trying to illustrate in that article for NPR a long time ago, that when when you go to your car and you write "wash me" on it, there are particles on your fingers there that actually just recently fell from interplanetary space. So the interesting thing here, and this is a point that David Grinspoon makes, is that for 4.5 billion years, stuff has been falling down from space onto the Earth. But
Right.
only in the last 70 years has stuff been lifting off, right? That's
Right.
the technosphere, is that for the first time in 4.5 billion years, stuff is lifting off of the planet and heading back out into space. And hopefully, if we can make it through what we have to make it through in the next 100 years or so, it's probably more than that. Then then our presence in the solar system will be ongoing, and that maybe if you were to come back in a millennia from now, the whole solar system would be inhabited.
So what's you talk about a lot of your work has been focused on this idea of humans integrating, normalizing the fact that they're not just a species on a planet, but that entity itself is the thing to think about.
Yeah, the biosphere. The biosphere is the thing to think about, and we tend to think of ourselves, and we tend to think of ourselves as somehow separate from the biosphere. And that,
Right.
particularly like with the climate crisis and everything, we tend to think of like, oh my God, look at what human beings are doing to the planet. We're horrible, we're terrible, and and then our job is to save the poor little bunny that is the planet. But I think that's really the wrong way to think about it. We need to think about um, climate and in general the things that we're doing as part of biospheric history, in which case we are just the latest, we're just the latest thing that the biosphere is doing. A technological civilization is the biosphere's latest invention. Dinosaurs were an invention. Prairies, grass was an invention. And when the biosphere invented grass, suddenly you had prairie, the whole new kind of biome, changed the history of the planet. And so, to think about what's happening with us now, not in political terms, not, in terms of, which group you want to join, but that this is an experiment the biosphere is running. And if it doesn't work out, the biosphere will just happy, to, as George Carlin said, to shake us off like fleas on a dog and just use what we've done. Like, we're clearly pushing the planet into a new climate state. It'll take that and be, thank you very much, and I'm going to use this to create some new species. So it's not about saving the Earth, it's about saving us. It's all about whether or not we're smart enough to reintegrate into the biosphere in a way that doesn't push on it, such that the conditions we need, the habitability of the planet for ourselves. We're not going to do anything to the biosphere that's going to endanger the biosphere. Come on. But yeah, so I think that's the key difference in thinking that it's going to be forced on us.
Yeah. Although the question is, in time, will it be in time? This, when I was at the Vatican in 2014 for this big conclave on sustainable humanity, this Cardinal Maradiaga opened this ceremony. Tons of scientists were there, everyone uh, and from that sphere of sustainability science. And he stood up and said, nowadays mankind feels more like a technical giant and an ethical child.
Yeah.
And those words ring in my head all the time.
Yeah.
And, when you think about CRISPR, when you think about AI now, of course,
Yeah,
and you think about war, the technology of war, and then you think about these things together, evolving. Our technosphere is evolving faster than our capacity to understand those interlinkages. You're seeing this even unfolding in the war that's unfolding in the Middle East right now. War is one of the most fundamentally chaotic and unpredictable phenomena itself. So holding those ideas in your head, and it's not just nature that doesn't give a shit about us. Our technology certainly doesn't give a shit about us either.
Right.
And so does it haunt you as much as it haunts me that we're getting so far ahead of our capacity to understand our systems, our technologies? And then we'll get to that question you've studied, which is modeling technological civilizations and understanding do they all blink out. So, but just preceding that, let's just talk about that basic idea. Looking around you now, seeing the pace of change in these interlaced technologies, how worried are you? And then we'll get into the sort of the science of it.
I'm worried all the time, but I'm also, I think it's really important to think on longer timescales, right? History. I mean, for myself and my children and everybody I love, I'm deeply concerned. But when I, step back and view it both as an astrobiologist and, someone who, an amateur historian, history is long And so, like, one of the places I've come to now, and this is an article I'm writing with, I'm starting to work on for Aon with the people from Berggruen, the Berggruen Institute, is the idea that, we're probably, the next century is, in the words of Barbara Tuchman when she wrote that great book on the 13th century, is going to be a difficult time for humanity, right? I can really imagine, because we're going to blow past 1.5 degrees. That's pretty clear. We have failed that exam. But, there's still going to be people on the planet, right? The idea, I think one of the things that we're being forced to is to sort of step a little back from our apocalyptic kind of visions of things. Even if we push up into 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees, the biosphere is still going to be here. There's still going to be human beings on the planet with their concerns, there may be a lot less of them. But, young people trying to figure out their lives, and we owe it to them to start thinking about now about this whole thing as being a generational project. It's going to be, I've been using the idea of the climate cathedral. It took, cathedrals took multiple generations. The generation that started the project couldn't say what the generation 2 down, 70 years, 200 years downstream was going to do with the project. And I think that's really the way we need to think about this now, is that we failed the test of being able to, immediately change. And now the Gaia is going to breathe down our necks and show us just exactly the power it has. And so we need to start sort of thinking about the long term, how to make it long term, because it's going to be at some point, right? At some point, it's going to get bad enough where, the system we have, and we already kind of see that in a way, it's just going to fall apart. And but there will be something on the other side, and it's time, I think, to start taking that seriously about the legacy of this. And maybe we shouldn't have expected to be able to do it in one generation, in 10 years. I was hoping, but maybe it has to be a generational kind of thing, just by the nature of how human beings learn and process information.
Yeah, and then also just how how our brains and our political systems, our political systems are designed around our brains, and our brains are very reactive and short term.
Right.
And how many times, actually, I've been talking to people about whether climate. Oh yeah, this came up in the context of journalism the other day. So a lot of climate journalists are trying to say, why can't we write more climate stories? Why are they cutting our climate stories and stuff? I've been writing about that since 1988.
Yeah.
And I said, well, newsrooms are fundamentally about what's happening now, and a little bit about the future. I've hit those walls before. But maybe you're just you have sort of overweening expectations about our ability to evolve toward, and this is beyond journalism, evolve toward having a politics or a journalism or other systems that can really do that time scale shift. Yeah, I was Long Now Foundation, the 10,000 year clock. I love it, but I'm like one of maybe 0.1% of the human population who even knows there is a 10,000 year clock.
Well, I think that's also part of the political economic systems that we've developed, right? The version of capitalism we have absolutely positively cannot think past a generation. It can't think past a quarter, right? So, I've heard this term that I really like called capitalist realism, which is basically somehow we got into this position where we can't even imagine, alternatives to the version we have, right? To what we have, right? I'm not even talking socialism. I'm just talking like that there could be other political economic arrangements, which might have aspects of capitalism, but that just don't look anything like this. So one of my favorite books from the last few years is The Dawn of Everything by David Gerber and David Wengrow, where they went back and they said, look, the last 30 years of archaeology and anthropology has basically shown that this narrative that human beings started as, we were all egalitarian, in these little groups, but then there was agriculture, and then we invented, farming, or, villages, which became cities, which became empires, and this like march towards the inevitable capitalist, hegemony. And they're like, human beings have been playing with political arrangements from day one. Like, you go back 9,000 years and you can find all kinds of political arrangements, including cities with 10,000 people in them that have no evidence of hierarchies, right? the idea was always like, once you get more than 150 people in one place, you got to have police and you got to have a king, and it's like that history shows, or the new evidence shows that may not be true at all. So I think we've been sold a bill of goods about like there's only one way to organize ourselves and it's inevitable, and that's really the fruit of the last 400 years of sort of European society discovering science, or taking the fruits of what culminating science, and that particular mindset spreading throughout the world. It's success in some ways, and it certainly had great things about it, had great successes, but climate, as well as all the horrors of colonialism, showed that it's not the only way. And so this idea that like human beings just can't think, in terms of multi-generational spaces, I think like, well, this political economy can't think that way, but I don't think it's necessarily true that human beings can't.
Well, and I hope we can break those patterns because you're still in the educational system, which mostly was designed to create functionaries who fit into that capitalist
Yeah.
industrial system. Do you see signs? I mean, AI in academia obviously is a huge issue in so many ways. Is there something percolating in the education area that you feel can break us out of that sense of these norms that we're stuck in, the path dependency that we all live with?
Well, this is what I think. I mean, this is where I'm at now. You and I have been talking about this for a couple of decades now, and the bad is the good in a certain way. Is that like, yeah, like I said, it's clear that we didn't do what we needed to do. We're going to bust through 1.5 degrees, and we're going to face the consequences. But the thing about human being, thing about evolution is you don't evolve unless you have to. And I think the strain that is going to come from this over a bunch of generations is going to reshape the political economy. It's going to reshape. It's dramatic enough that I don't think what we have now is what's going to be here in 150 years. Like the nation state, right? The nation state, which everything is built around, comes from the Treaty of Westphalia, right? I mean, or Westphalia, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, right? So are we going to have nation states in 150 years? I don't know, probably not. We'll have some other kind of arrangement for a climate changed world that's going to make sense for a climate changed world. And I do have faith in human beings. I think, the progress that we made overall in understanding the world and understanding ourselves since the Enlightenment, what we were bequeathed from the Enlightenment, I think there's enough in that to sort of push us through. But I think, as I said, what we need now is sort of what comes after the Enlightenment, which is a vision of life and the world where life is central, right? The thing about what came out of the Enlightenment was that living systems were just robots; they're just machines, and a forest is only a bunch of lumber,
Right.
And so I see this in science. We've been writing about this a lot. We did a book recently, me and two others, called The Blind Spot, where we really examined within science sort of this now what I would say is it's a failed metaphysics that lasted for a couple hundred years about what science says. And it never was what science says. It was a particular metaphysical bias that actually had a lot to do with the political economies that we got. And that has run its course. And now there is something else emerging that is much more life-centric, and it is much more biosphere centric. And that is what I can imagine. The fruits of this, or the contours of this, are just starting to become clear, or starting to emerge. Because when we wrote that book, we thought that book was going to be really heretical. We thought people were going to want to burn us at the stake. But in fact, the reviews were great. This book, I was very surprised by the response to this book. As I said, you can't be a heretic if no one wants to set you on fire. And there's other people doing other similar kinds of work. I think this recognition that life is different, I think is emerging. And out of that, I think can, not will, not guaranteed, can come a very different way for human beings to exist in the world. And I think we're going to be pushed in that by the difficulty that's coming. And like I said, I'm not sugarcoating it. I think the next 100 years are going to be difficult for humanity. And I can't say for sure this kind of society will make it through, but I'm hopeful.
We'll have to dig in more on the hopeful part, because it's hard for us in the moment especially a moment like this where the world's shifting toward authoritarianism. There's a new. I had on this team a year ago on here on February, yeah, on they track vital signs for authoritarian versus sort of open, equitable government, and 3/4 of the planet lives under authoritarian regimes right
Yeah.
now. I mean, China and India are a big chunk of that, and think about the United States right now. And they just came out with their new report, and now they said the United States is basically poised not to be a democracy.
Yeah.
And although they do say it takes time, you have to have like 10 years of baking and simmering before it's hard to come back.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so I guess that's another sense of another indication of or an example where patience somehow feels like it's hope and patience are still in the mix, even as we face what we face right now.
Hope and patience are actually, and that's why I think it's important for people on the day-to-day level, right? And so there's actually a spiritual component of this, right? I mean, right, the world's a mess, you know, and you're just in your life, and there's literally only so much you can do as an individual, right? At the base level, you can just be kind to people, right? You can just, treat each human being with respect and dignity. And then you can, use your resources. You can give money to the groups you think are doing good work. And then you can do your own work of going to rallies or whatever it is you're going to do. But at the end of the day, you're only given so many hours on this planet. And so spending every moment of it, in terror, you're not helping anybody, right? You're not helping the future by being freaked out 99.9% of the time. So that's why I think, it's really important to understand that your life is one little blip in a, evolving across billions of years. Really, this is, you have to think about the history of the biosphere. And this is part of the history of the biosphere. Like, in other words, you need to step back and we have to see our lives in context. And, the shit could really hit the fan, and we will all have to live with it. I'm the child of a Holocaust survivor. My mom, when she was 9, was put on a train. My mom remembered, she's passed now, but she remembered Crystal Night quite vividly. She was a 9-year-old, and then 2 weeks later, she was put on a train and sent to England. And then luckily my grandparents were able to get her. People live through incredibly horrible things. And if that's what the fate we get, then we live through it and do the best we can and be lights in the midst of that. But when that happens, then you face what that happens. But right now, you do what you can in the life that you're given. So that sort of idea of like 99% terror, what does it do? Like, how is this helping anything? So, history will play out. We will play our roles in that history, but history is long. I read a lot of science fiction, and there's a whole, sort of genre of science fiction where like it's 200 years in the future, and the characters are looking back and they're like, wow, that was really hard, but we made it through, right? And maybe that's our fate, and our fate is in this course. So yeah, I just think it's important to like lift yourself up out of the immediate moment, so to get a broader perspective.
Yeah, actually, I'd love if you could repeat that. You said something really important, and it's worth hammering one more time, which is you're not doing it yourself or the future any favors by just flailing. Just revisit that, because I want those words to sink in.
Yeah. Well, this is, I'm a practicing Buddhist. I've been staring at a wall for 30 years. And one of the things, the purpose of contemplative practice is to just become aware of your mind, right? Of what's happening in your mind. And one of the things you see is that, your thoughts will just roll on and roll on and roll on, and they actually don't really mean that much. But we are at the mercy of our thoughts most of the time. And so the important thing to understand is that if you're living in terror of what's happening at this moment, it's not helping anything, right? Absolutely everybody should take action in whichever way they feel they can. But after the action is over, after you've gone to the rally, gone to the hearing, sent the money in, what next, right? I mean, still being in terror, you've done what you could do. History is much bigger than you are, and again, it's not just the political history, it's the planetary history. We are all enmeshed in the biosphere, and the biosphere has a long history. And so you have to sort of take peace, from that. Take peace from the reality of really what we are, where we are, and how we are.
Right. And that's this I you do reflect, even in that book you mentioned, and in your practice, you're reflecting this sort of integration of science and religion and philosophy. We've just joined our local Unitarian Universalist congregation here in down East Maine, because in the midst of all this stuff, we've been thinking about community. I part of like they did a little informal training. Oh, I should put this up. It's so funny. Um, we went to a website called Belief-O-Matic. Oh yeah, there's this Belief-O-Matic thing. You could take a quiz. What religion am I? And the questions are like only one God, etc. And I ended up I'm a secular humanist.
Right.
And there's also religious humanists and stuff. And it was really interesting. But I found, I do think about science all the time, and I try to base my journalism on things that I know, or things that I know I don't know, to
Right.
be clear about that stuff. But at the same time, having a sense of how the humanistic side of our our being fits into how we look at the world and interact with people and interact with nature is really important too.
Yeah,
But
no, and I think that's
everyone
what.
should check out Belief-O-Matic. Just Google for that.
But I want to emphasize that contemplative practice has nothing to do with belief, right? That's the great thing about it. And there's
A good point.
every religion has had its contemplative practice. And my first book was actually about science and religion, where really what I was focusing on is experience. Forget dogmas, scriptures are supposed to be poetry. They're not supposed to be taken literally. And that is the great problem with religion, and particularly when you see science and religion. But, contemplative practice is about a direct encounter with experience. It's about stabilizing the mind, stabilizing the mind so you can actually, have experience, be approach your experience in a way that you're not at you're not at the whim of the monkey mind, which is always just bouncing around. So from that, now you can do that within a particular religious context.
Right.
And I think Buddhism is the religion, and Buddhism is a religion. Anybody who wants to tell you Buddhism is a philosophy or something, that's not true. It's a religion, but it's a religion without a god. It just doesn't have it's atheistic. But the purpose here is really to get closer to experience, because and that's why the thing I was saying before, we are not just our minds, our daily thoughts. I guess the endless run, the stream of consciousness. There is so much more to what we are than just that. And without contemplative practice, it's very hard to even know that's happening. And so, the point of sitting for an hour or whatever, is to actually begin to experience the deep ocean below the discursive mind. And then you see oh, actually, there's quite a bit going on here that, and that's where you actually find your freedom. You find freedom in the midst of the daily insanity.
Yeah, here's a comment that's just come in from LinkedIn, but John Niles. Great conversation. So glad you brought in mindfulness and meditation. I take comfort in thinking, weirdly, admittedly, that the biosphere and nature, to me at least, seem to have a Buddhist-like element. Doing more to emulate can provide some comfort.
Yeah, I agree with that, in the sense that, one of the reasons I'm an avid, I'm sure as you are, avid hiker, and backpacker. As my knees get worse, though, the little less backpacking. But, one of the reasons I love being in the woods, even a small stand, like any place nature's been just left alone to do its own thing, because that's exactly it. It's just doing its own thing. There's no, the forest isn't thinking about oh my God, what am I going to do tomorrow? What'll happen? Oh, what about me? How do people think about me? Is the president a good one or a bad one? Literally tens of thousands, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years have just been playing out with this dense system that is, in its sense, sentient, right? There's lots of sentience around, but it is just, doing what it does. And that's kind of part of what this, what contemplative practice sort of teaches you about, is just being here and doing what you're doing without so much judgment about it.
Yeah. So much of what you're describing is in the realm of the behavioral side of things, as opposed to the physics side of things. And how do you grapple with that? I know you did a piece in the Atlantic recently on the limits of physics and thinking about biology, if I have that right.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it the limit. So one of the things, that I've been doing for the last 5 or 6 years is I've moved over into what might be called the physics of life. And this came from my biospheric studies. So I did a paper with David Grinspoon and Sarah Walker back in 2001 called Planetary Intelligence, where we were asking whether or not the planet as a whole should be something, the biosphere should be something that we could consider to have collective intelligence, right? Like there's this idea, I love this word, liquid brains, right? It's been recognized, people who study complex systems like the brain, or like ant colonies, or like bacterial colonies, have come to recognize that there's brains can be solid and where the neurons are all fixed in place, but in like an ant colony you have collective intelligence, and you have and so that's kind of like a liquid brain, it can flow. And so we were asking whether or not the biosphere as a whole might be thought of as something that has a kind of distributed intelligence. And that paper took me in all kinds of amazing directions. And one of the places in the research I was doing led me to an idea called of semantic an information theory that is about meaning rather than just symbols and how often they occur, which is what all of our computers are built on, what's called syntactic information. And so that led me, I started this project with others about it's been leading me down this road about the physics of life. And the question here is really, why is life different, right? To me, what I'm going to argue, and that's all in part of that book, The Blind Spot we were talking about, life, we're not robots, right? A cell is not just a biological machine. That machine metaphor, which kind of emerged out of the Enlightenment, is completely wrong. And we do not really understand what makes life different. And I think there is, because actually of artificial intelligence in a lot of ways, this question is now becoming very important. And so our argument, and what we're trying to explore using physics, well, actually, it's going to be very transdisciplinary. It's really in the realm of complex systems, which is a whole new field that has emerged over the last 30 years. And it's very, multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary. But it's to kind of have a theory, a verifiable, mathematical, experimental theory about life as a fundamentally different kind of system where you have to take sentience, that sort of basic aliveness, as being fundamental. It's not, it's not an illusion. It's not something that, sort of is like, well, it's just a computer really, but then it thinks that it's aware. No, from cells all the way up, sentience is this sort of fundamental property that we need to understand how it emerges, how it works. And I think the consequences of this are profound. If we actually do that, what we're going to find is that we are central to all our scientific stories, right? We've had this, the Enlightenment gave us the idea that science gives us a God's eye view, right? This view of the universe from outside. And I think one of the things that will come from this is that there is no outside view. That's a mistake. That's a story that we tell ourselves. There are first-person views, right? That's the one that's real. That's what we have. And I can't have a first-person view without a second-person view. I need you, right? Because I'm part of a community of language users, a community of life.
Right.
That's what's central. And I think once you start down that road, suddenly our place in the biosphere now becomes central. It's not secondary. It's not. So again, this idea that we have 100, 200 years ahead of us of rebuilding what we are. And I think this view of a physics of life, of a new understanding of life, where life becomes central. The Big Bang that mattered was somehow this emergence of living systems. I think that is really actually going to be fundamental to this change that I'm talking about.
Well, I assume in discussing the word life there, you're talking about life and its tools, meaning our internet, etc. I noticed just now as we were talking, I was Googling a little bit, and the World Economic Forum had a session on what is planetary intelligence? How could it move AI from the internet to the real world?
Yeah. It's been
So
very, we wrote that paper. When we wrote that paper, I have to say, it was like, I mean, that was the most exciting paper on the planetary intelligence that I'd ever written. It took me like a year. And I was like, at one point, I was, in the desert in Nevada. And another point, I was in the mountains of Colorado, just thinking about this stuff. And at the time, the paper was kind of, as I jokingly called it, a steaming pile of speculation, right? Because,
yeah.
it's grounded in science, but we were clearly speculating about possibilities. But the idea of planetary intelligence has really picked up. Others have picked up on this idea and they're doing their own thing with it. And the idea is something you and I have talked about a lot, the technosphere, right? There's the biosphere, which has been around for at least 3.5 billion years. But the technosphere is new, this thing that we have built,
Right.
which in some sense, as you said, is almost independent of us, becoming independent of us. And the idea of needing the technosphere to become mature in the same way that the biosphere has become mature, that it exerts it self-regulates the planet and itself. And right now the technosphere doesn't. We have an immature technosphere, which is destroying its own foundations. So I'm seeing like this idea of planetary intelligence that we first talked about being integrated into discussions, and like the way that the technosphere could become part of that planetary intelligence of monitoring the what's happening on the planet and allowing us to adjust what we're doing for the good of the biosphere technosphere sort of coupling.
Oh, that's so interesting. Um, maybe this could bring us, if we find a way, if we, and of course the we is always a question. Who's the we?
Yeah, well, that
Is
is
it, is
true.
it Peter Thiel and
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and Elon Musk, or is it a bigger we? But if our
Better be.
technology, it becomes a moderator or a modulator of our adverse impacts, and a facilitator of our positive possibilities, it feels fantastic. Although that takes me back to when Pope Francis came through New York City. This is like, I don't know, 2012 or something. There was a meeting on climate and civilization, and I was speaking there, and this other guy, some sustainability modeler who done some work for the EPA, Heriberto Cabezas or something. He gave a talk on. He had this slide that blew my mind. He basically said there's six. That he did a lot of modeling, and he figured out that there's a. Oh, you know what? I've got it right here. I was hoping I could find it. So this was like his slide deck. Is global sustainability possible? And 2015, blah blah blah. And this was the conclusion: coordinated manipulation of at least 6 variables is necessary to maintain stability for 200 years or so. And as he's saying this and showing this slide, my brain is kind of burning. I'm thinking, that is not the world I know.
Right.
There is no master, Wizard of Oz there with knobs. I see a world of fairly constrained chaos and emergent properties. And I was raising my hand like a kid in high school, like, wait.
Oh.
Yeah, and he said, and I asked him, that doesn't sound like the world I know. And this is his answer. I blogged about this after. He said, we lack a cultural narrative that says sustainability is really important. We have a cultural narrative that says murder is wrong. We don't have a cultural narrative that says managing our planet in a way that allows us to live on it as long as we can is probably the most important thing. Yeah. So maybe it sounds like you're saying, if we can get our technology to be the grown up in the room and do that stuff for us.
We're the grown up in the room. Our technology is, it's not going to operate independent of us. But this goes to the point of what we meant by a mature. In that paper, we talked about the idea of a mature technosphere, right?
Right.
So let me tell so the mature technosphere is not just the technology, and this was Peter Half's idea, right? When he introduced the idea of the technosphere, it's also information. It's all the bureaucracies and the treaties and the NGOs and so let me give you an example of how that plays out in a mature technosphere. Like right now, I can't go to a bank and be like, hey man, I'd like to take out a loan for a nuclear weapon. They'd be like, what are you talking about? We can't give you a loan for a nuclear weapon, right? It's just, that's not the system, the economic, regulatory systems, et cetera, won't allow it. So, 200 years from now, I go into a bank and I say, hey, I want a loan for a coal a coal-fired power plant, right? And they'd be like, what are you talking about? That's insane. Like, we can't do that. The system doesn't allow that. And so that is That's what I mean about a mature technosphere. Like we're just the rules, and that's why, again, as you said, we're like, well, right now we live in, it's chaos. Who's turning the knobs? Again, we have a political economy, a system inherited from the Enlightenment, from that period, and it's just not up to the task. And because it's not up to the task, we are about to we're sailing into very dangerous waters, right? And it's not clear this system. There's going to be a lot of suffering. I mean, it's because this is the product of not having the right system, and this has happened before, right? In some ways, and what we can hope, what we can try and guide, is do our best for our children and their children, is to set up the systems that will allow these difficult times to be navigated and the pressures that will come from these difficult times. So what emerges from it is, you can't ignore the biosphere, right? You and I have been around long enough to watch the transition from like the early 90s, when both of us were writing about climate change, and we'd show the graphs and people were like, whatever, to now like, oh, the skies are red over New York because there are fires burning in Ontario, right? And we are starting to see true effects, like visible effects of climate change. But this is just a teaser trailer. It's not even the trailer for climate change. Right. It's the teaser trailer. So things, we're going to be seeing really strong effects. And when that happens, I just can't imagine that people are still going to allow themselves to be snowed by politicians saying it's a hoax, it's not true. I mean, at some point, it's going to become so obviously true that, like, the name, remember Senator in Hafe,
Oh, sure.
Yeah, like his, you won't be able to mention, no one will name their kid, people whose last name is Inhafe will change their names because, nobody has the name Hitler anymore, right? I mean, they will be remembered for how they held us back, right? Yeah. Because of the consequences of their holding us back from doing anything are going to be so dramatic that, that we will build systems that simply don't allow this to happen anymore.
Yeah, I hate to keep feeling like a curmudgeon, but the problem here too is that when I did some writing several times about work on people's reactions to disaster, and essentially the simplest way to think of it is disaster makes you more of who you are already, or who you were. There was a guy named George Marshall who went down to Bastrop County, Texas, after epic fires there, and he did interviewing with people. He's a climate communications person, and essentially you boil it down, and the libertarians became survivalists, and communitarians became socialists.
Right.
So it just intensifies it. It takes you into where it's very hard to move you out of your to do the tipping point into a new space.
And again, remember that those, you're still, everything that was happening there was still embedded in a kind of world system that had not been affected. Like, okay, there were fires in your neighborhood, right? But you're still looking at your cell phone, getting news from CNN or Fox or whatever. It's not like, the fundamentals of the world system were changed. And also, we're talking generational changes, right? Which is, we're not talking about, oh, something happened last week and how did people respond? We're talking about sustained, systematic shifts in what's possible. And so, we're talking about something that's, I think if you want an example of, you want to think about something, you got to think about the Black Plague, right? How did the Black Plague, what effect did that have on society, right? You lost, a third or a half of the population of Europe. And what happened from that was the end of serfdom, right? Suddenly there weren't enough workers around to keep the farms going. And so suddenly people could be like, the serfs were like, you need to pay me if you want me to work for you. And that was the beginning of, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and modern capitalism came from that scale shift in what was happening. And I think, and again, this idea of the dawn of everything is a great book to read for sort of a different account of, like, human beings are very inventive when it comes to their political arrangements, if they're allowed to. And as system, it's very hard to have a new system when the old system is still in place. I think you can already see it happening. under the force of climate, under the force of these new technologies, the systems that you and I grew up with, the systems that we inherited from the 16 and 1700s have kind of reached their limit, or are starting to. They're starting to. It may take another few generations.
What's your sense of what young people? I'm not sure how much you're doing in the classroom these days, but
I'm still teaching. Yeah.
what are they feeling when you look out across their beaming faces? And we've heard so much about climate doomism, and that doesn't lead it leads in the opposite direction from what you were recommending a little while ago.
I find actually these students, I'm very impressed with my students. I find that they are aware of what's going on. They sort of, you have a range of opinions, right? Some people, are like, everything's going to be great, and some people are, more, doomeristic. But I find that in general, they're smart and they're capable and they are enthusiastic. And this is what I mean about, like, everybody's not going to die, right? It's not the future is not Mad Max globally. There may be some places that are Mad Max. There are already some places that are Mad Max, but the whole world won't be Mad Max. And people are going to do what they can to make things better where they can. And so we can't lose sight of that. If and I think this is an interesting question. That with the New York Times, I was talking to one of the editors there about the idea of doing a story about this. Like, maybe the whole 1.5, 2 degrees thing was a mistake, right, for us, because we were like, 1.5 degrees or everybody dies, and it's going to be like, hot rods in the desert and shotguns and leather jackets with spikes on them. Like, maybe that was a mistake because we didn't offer anybody, there was no vision of past that. Like, either we held it to 1.5 degrees or everybody died. And that may have been that. I'm not sure, but that may have been a mistake, because here we are at 1.5.
Oh, it was. I've written off and on it was a big mistake, and I think Gavin Schmidt, you're a co-author with your fascinating work on
the Silurian hypothesis.
Yeah, but Gavin, a long time ago, he was warning against threshold thinking.
Yeah,
and because of, as soon as you're past that threshold, then people go, "Oh, okay, now what do we do?"
Exactly, and I think that was
among many other reasons.
Yeah. So that's what people should understand. I mean, that's what history is long. People have lived through very difficult times, and if it's our turn, then it's our turn. I wish it wasn't so. There's the great line in Lord of the Rings where, like, Frodo is like, I don't want to carry the ring. I don't want to do this. I want to hang out in Hobbitville, and
Yeah, here we are.
It's mine. And Gandalf is like, we don't get to choose what time we live in. We can our only choice is how we respond to it.
That's so interesting. Yeah, and here we are. And it is. There's a professor of management at Cornell a long time ago. I heard him give a talk, and he was talking about chronocentrism, the idea that every generation feels it's special. The World War II, but it does feel to me like this juncture is particularly sort of, there's some on-off switches, nuclear war.
Yeah.
I mean, that maybe that's still the only real. Do you see, in terms of assessing, when you build your models of planetary intelligence and how many of them navigate the threshold, how big a deal what are the extinction factors?
Yeah, well, our models were really about energy use and the feedback from it. So at least in those ones, we found that about a third of the planet had a third of the civilizations. And again, these were very simple models. But a third of the civilizations had what we called a soft landing. The temperature increased, the population increased, but you reached a plateau. So that was good news. So nuclear war, I mean, it's interesting talking to the people from the existential threat communities, right? There's a whole, the people at Oxford, there's a whole community of scholars who are thinking about these existential threats.
Right.
AI being one of them. I'm not one of these people who thinks that super intelligence is around the corner. I think that's complete hype. Designed to sell more of whatever they want to sell.
Right.
But it is AI. There's real dangers with the deployment of these technologies into our lives. But So yeah, I think those the there are real dangers, but I think very few of them lead to like you're gone.
Right.
Humanity's gone.
Yeah.
You know what is interesting though is worth talking about, which I just don't think gets enough coverage. So if you're older than a certain age, I don't know exactly what it is. We all grew up with like overpopulation,
Oh yeah.
overpopulation, don't have babies, overpopulation is terrible. The world's going to be teeming and hot and sweaty and too many of us. And now every demographic model out there shows the world population peaking around 2080 and then coming down naturally without disaster.
Right.
We're not even including disasters and climate change. It just, if you educate people enough, if they have a certain level of wealth, then they just naturally stop having that many babies. Every developed
Yeah.
country in the world, and maybe develops the wrong world, it has negative growth. India,
Right.
India is at replacement right now, their birth rate. So it's like, so here was this thing that we all grew up being told that like overpopulation is the worst problem. What are we going to do about it? And this is just an example of like, you don't know things are going to work out. It may be that we're going to end up in, if we make it through on a planet with incredible technology, that has 1 billion people on it or less, in which case there's going to be more than enough for everybody, unless, of course, the Peter Thiels and the Elon Musks keep it all for themselves, which is exactly what they want. But, the point is this thing that we were told was a huge problem.
Yep.
Was worked out. It worked out. And I think climate change is not going to be like that because we've already committed ourselves. There's going to be profound changes to the planet. We are going to be living on a different version of Earth. But it's not a version of Earth that's uninhabitable for human beings, right? And it's certainly not a dead biosphere by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah. Now, but this gets to another trait or situation I always see. I knew Paul Ehrlich pretty well through his work. Not back when his book came out that was so catastrophically, wrong,
Right.
in 1968. And now that he just passed away at age 93, there's a lot of people, assessing his impact, and the sort of libertarian and other communities are showing these old clips of him doing ridiculously onerous, making statements about government, needing to take control of your family size, etc. But now we're in the world of the techno folks like Elon Musk saying that the depopulation is a crisis. It's going to be existential, et cetera, et cetera.
No way. Yeah.
So it just seems almost impossible to have a discourse that doesn't take the needle right to each edge of the debate. And you're either a Paul Ehrlichian or you're an imploder or an exploder. And I find this. I don't know how you find a way to navigate that stuff, except through science.
I think we've hit on it in some sense, right? This view, this biospheric view, the long view, right? That recognize, and then also the view that comes from contemplative practice, which is the view that you don't know. But the biggest problem for human beings is certainty, right? And this is sort of what came out of the bad part of the blind spot, what we call the blind spot, the view that science will give you certainty, absolute certainty, and that we're never certain about anything. Science does it. Science is incredibly powerful and allows us to get into a dialogue with nature that is quite potent, and for certain things certainly gives us a degree of control that we didn't have before, which is great. But it doesn't give us some kind of infinite certainty. And so that's really what we need, is we need to be more comfortable with uncertainty as human beings, and how we treat each other, the kindness and compassion that we treat each other with. But yeah, what I think, these stories show us is that, any kind of totalizing, which includes catastrophizing, is a mistake, and it's not helpful.
And just some capacity, hopefully the average person, whoever that is, can find a way to step back from the yelling and actually find sources of data. Like Our World in Data is a fantastic resource. That's not what I wanted to show. That's Paul Ehrlich.
Paul Ehrlich,
yeah, but let me. I had something.
Everybody's gonna die.
Yeah, I had something set up and it didn't show me the right thing. Oh, here it is.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
this is all three statements are true at the same time. The world is
Yeah,
awful. The world is much better, and it can be much better.
yeah,
And it's this is data on child mortality, and so you can cast that in your brain or in a tweet or in a story any way you want. And the reality is, when you look at it, you see there's so much potential for moving forward in the positive way that you're describing. But it does require taking a breath.
yeah. And it's recognizing, the sort of, there's lots of different realities. I mean, for indigenous communities, the apocalypse has been here for a while, right? The shatter
Yeah,
zone of what happened, as a colonialism that just took these vibrant working communities and just tore them apart, right? That's part of the legacy of the version of capitalism we have. So when I say that, I always want, people are like, whoa, what do you mean? Communism? Communism and socialism are both industrial extractive economies too, right? So we're trying to look to something that maybe has elements of capitalism, which has great things, but just doesn't suck the air out of the room, turning everything into a commodity. Like, is impossible to see the value, the inherent value of living systems, the inherent value, nothing to do with how much you can sell them for.
right.
So it's this recognition that depending on who you are and where you are, things can be incredibly terrible, and they have been for a while because of the systems that the rest of us have been benefiting from. So it's all true. It's all true at the same time, and
Yeah, I'm
yeah,
showing. This
yeah,
is 2016. It was one of the last years where I flew a lot, and I was in Nairobi and Singapore in the same year.
yeah.
And it turned out I did some mapping. It turns out they're both about 80 miles from the equator.
Wow.
And the place on the top was this. If you've been to the gardens by the bay in Singapore, it's like the
Yeah,
world's biggest domed botanical garden.
yeah.
They actually have a dome there that's like Mediterranean climate. So you're on the steamy equator, and there's olive trees and oregano plants
Wow.
at like 68 degrees. And it shows you what wealth and technology can do, right?
Yeah,
It's Singapore, one of the richest places around. And then I was in the slum, the Matari slum in Nairobi, and same distance from the equator, completely different sense of vulnerability and possibility. And
yeah,
you made a really important point in pulling back, not thinking about the data just in the context of your experience, but realizing that the human experience right now on this planet has every experience,
every
pre-industrial,
experience. Right.
hyper-industrial,
Yeah,
and everything in between, slavery and
yeah,
opportunity. It's all
yeah,
there.
yeah. And I think that's part of for me, with contemplative, going back to contemplative practice. When I came to contemplative practice, I came to Buddhism, like everybody else did, because of whatever I was suffering, the usual things in life, and but I came to it because, just like as a physicist, I wanted to understand the world, right? And this by I wanted to understand the truth with a capital T. And then what I realized, as everybody does, is like, you come for enlightenment, but you leave with compassion, because there is no way to enlighten, whatever they mean by enlightenment. With compassion is the road, is to like recognize you are everybody else. There is no separation between you and everybody else. And that, I think, clearly we don't have a whole lot of that in our society, but I can imagine, that events and changes, and we may be able to develop societies in the face of what we're going to go through that have more of that.
And technology can be a part of that too. This is the other
Absolutely.
thing, there's Jonathan Haidt, and everyone is trying to get kids to turn off their phones and stuff. A lot of that is justified at certain ages, but the idea that we need to get off the internet, which is connecting us right now from um, in toto, or just turning everything off, going back to a flip phone, that may be appropriate for certain people, but there's such upside potential in
I know.
building an empathic, aware sense of the wider human experience through these technologies too. It's all
Yeah,
how you use it.
I know it's all, but also because I agree, because I'm both addicted to my phone, and I'm also like, God, I wish I wasn't addicted to my phone. And I'm constantly trying, to manage my digital life. But again, like you said, the potency of these technologies is amazing. But again, this goes to the idea of, which political economy do we have, and what are its values? Because if the internet hadn't been sort of taken over, so to speak, because I remember the internet when it was NSFnet, I think I was the first person in the world who found out that they were going to be a dad via the internet or via, the email. You know, so when the version of the internet that we had could have been quite different if it wasn't, taken over by Google, by these tech giants who really, so right, you've heard the word shitification, right?
Yeah, he's been on the show.
Yeah, right. So, there could have been a lot of different kinds of internet. And the one
Yeah.
that the political economy we have, the kinds of capitalism we have, what it drove us to was this one that is really wants you to be addicted, is using everything we learned from psychology to keep you addicted. So, I think these technologies are amazing, but we have a right to sort of demand better versions of them. And this is the thing about AI right now is we have a right to say, no, we don't want this kind of AI deployed. And, I think, and it's interesting, I think in the next election, the party that figures out how to tap the profound suspicion that people have about these technologies is the party that will win. I think, because I think a lot of people are like, no, I don't want the data center on the thing. And I certainly don't, I see the dangers. I don't want my job taken by these things either. So that's a
Yeah.
whole other subject.
Well, this has been really cool hour. I feel like we should convene more regularly than once every few years.
Yeah, no, that'd be good. These are always great conversations.
I want to get you on with Sarah Walker and with David Grinspoon. We tried to do that a couple of years ago, but it's hard to
try to get three of us at the same time.
No.
Forget about it.
Herding cats and herding scientists.
Exactly.
But this was great, and
great.
we again, there's so much more to. We didn't even get into UFOs and aliens, but
I know.
Well, do you have 2 more minutes?
Sure. Let's do 2 more minutes, and then I do have to go because I have a 2:30 meeting about UFOs and aliens.
Oh, you do?
Well, it's about technosignatures. It's a research group project that we're doing about just about life in the universe.
So, what's your take on this coming and going and coming again of the ufology, UAP, UFO mania that comes and goes and comes and goes, and then having that in the context of interplanetary life?
Yeah, I do think. I mean, there's so much ridiculousness going on there. I mean, first of all, I just want to say the idea that UFOs represent, visitations by aliens. Look, I'm open. If you can give me real data, I'm open to looking at it because we have projects. I'm involved in projects that explore the idea of what we call solar system technosignatures. Could there be stuff left in the solar system? Maybe they visited 1 billion years ago and there's stuff, in orbit or on the moon or something. We actually have projects that we're thinking about for doing that. And so, a UFO as an alien visitor would just be a concurrent example of that. But the problem is the data sucks. The data, it's always fuzzy blobs and personal stories. And the pilots, I'm glad those pilots are able to tell their stories, but personal testimony is the worst form of evidence. There's nothing you can do with it. It doesn't lead to the next question. But I think that, the waves of it that happen actually, and the current wave is really because of the progress we're making with the real search, the scientific search for life in the universe. Every other day, the news story has a planet similar to Earth has been found. The most Earth-like exoplanet. So for the last 30 years, we've been finding planets orbiting other stars. Now we're at the point where we're able to look into their atmospheres and tell what's in the atmospheres. And the little book of aliens that I wrote a couple of years ago. The whole point of that was to show people how close we are to actually getting an answer to this question. Like over the next 10, 20, 30 years, we will have telescopic studies that can find life on distant planets, across 100 light year spatial scale. So I think, in some sense, the UFO stuff is part of it is in response to sort of this general cultural vibe that's coming from the actual science of like, what? Life in the universe is a real possibility. And we are on the road to actually getting answers to that. In your, if you're younger than me, and maybe even me, in your lifetime, we will. I don't know what the answers are going to be. It could be that life's not common, but we will have some answers.
Yeah, and at the same time, you also have the capacity now in the last few years to propagate continually through social media every possible little flicker of something. So that, and then you have politicians who amplify it. It gets and special interests. I several years ago when I did a show on on this entity within the Pentagon that's been set up to.
What is it? AVSO, AAVO?
Well, it's basically a government enterprise mandated by Congress to get into the UAP UFO issue, and when you dig in, the people who are doing it are, it's motivated reasoning. They're trying to make money, build an entity,
Yeah.
and
Bureaucratic.
some congressmen and congresswomen like the idea, and then becomes self-sustaining.
Right, self-propagating.
It's sort of weird.
Well, they're actually the one there was. I've talked with some of those guys, and I think they're actually doing a pretty good job. They are like the guy, I can't remember his name, who's the head of the AAVO. I think it's All Domain Anomaly something. So I'm not even sure if I've got it right. But they are doing, they're doing a pretty good job of okay, send us what you saw. We will get to work on it. And what they found is, of course, as every other study that's ever been done, 95, 96% of all the sightings are explainable.
Right.
And so, the sky is not full of things that, there it is. All domain anomaly. The sky is not full of things that you can't understand. And then that remaining 4%, some of those, you don't even have enough information to start a real investigation. And some of the remaining are freaky deaky, right? Doesn't mean they're aliens, but they resist explanation. So I'm all in favor of sure, figure out a way of studying. You got to catch, the problem is you need the technology to catch them. The old data is no good because there's really not even any data. But yeah, the freaky deaky ones, let's look at them.
Absolutely. Yeah, and having a normalized way a peer-reviewed way to sort of assess things, for sure.
Which is happening too, so that's good.
Yeah, and here's you can go to the website of the the not the AARP, AARO.
Well, it's something to do when you're a member of the AARP.
Yeah, so everyone, that's right. AARO.mil. And they have a lot of the
you can submit the thing you saw. But what they found so far is that the overwhelming majority of them are explainable. So this idea that oh my God, the sky is full of unexplained things, that's the hype that Congress is giving. And anyway, though, I should probably go.
Well, this is great. Thanks again for spending the time.
Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure, Andy.
It's great to catch up with you.
Yeah.
This has been a great episode of Sustain What. Those who are watching, you can get in touch with me through that information in the distracting scroll bar, and I can pass questions to Adam if need be. And this all gets archived, and you can share it after the fact. Thanks again.
Adam, if people want to find me, just because a plug for my newsletter. That's my big effort right now.
Absolutely.
Everymansuniverse.com.
Yep. I'll show it one more time. Here we go. Everyman's Universe.
Yeah.
And it's great. It's great reading. Great reading. So thanks again.
Thank you, Andy. It was a real pleasure.
And we'll meet again, presuming.
Let's talk again soon. Yeah.
Presuming we're right about the longevity of things.
That's good. So we will have time to meet again.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.